Pablo Escobar, Al Capone and Bonnie Parker are some of the most famous criminals in history. But could any of them plant a bomb on an airplane, walk away with 200,000 in ransom money, and then jump from the aircraft into the darkness, never to be seen again? D.B.Cooper did. Meet the man at the center of today's story. The only person in American history to successfully hijack a commercial airliner and seemingly vanish without a trace. More than 50 years later, his case continues to inspire books, documentaries, movies, and countless investigations. Who was he? Did he survive? And how did he pull off one of the most audacious crimes in American history? Today, I invite you to look at the D.B.Cooper case from a different perspective. But before we begin, don't forget to leave a comment and hit the like button. It really helps the channel. When you hear the words airplane hijacking, your mind probably jumps straight to horrific terrorist attacks. Events like September 11, when 4 passenger airlines were hijacked by terrorists. 2 were flown into the Twin Towers, 1 struck the Pentagon, and nearly 3,000 people lost their lives. But Cooper's hijacking was very different. This wasn't an act of terrorism, it was a robbery. In many ways, it was closer to an old Wild West train robbery than anything else. But how do you rob an airplane that is flying thousands of feet above the ground? And more importantly, how do you survive afterward? You can't exactly jump out the way a train robber might leap from a moving train. To pull off something like that, you have to think a little differently. You have to think like Cooper. And speaking of Cooper, we know almost nothing about him. Unlike criminals such as Al Capone, whose lives was extensively documented, D.B.Cooper remains a completely mystery. In fact, even the name Don Cooper, the name he gave to the flight attendants, was almost certainly fake. Everything we know about him could fit into a single paragraph. He appeared to be a man somewhere between 40 and 50 years old, around 6 feet tall, dark hair, dark eyes, calm, polite, and remarkably composed. As you can probably tell, that description could apply to millions of men. And that is exactly what made him so difficult to identify. Now let's move on to the robbery itself. November 24, 1971. A man walks into Portland International Airport. He looks like an ordinary businessman. Dark suit, tie, raincoat, briefcase. Nothing about him seems suspicious. He simply walks up to the ticket counter and says, "One ticket to Seattle." He pays in cash and receives his boarding pass. Inside the briefcase was what he claimed to be a bomb. Whether it was real or not, nobody knows to this day. But how was he able to bring a bomb onto an airplane in the first place? To understand that, it's important to remember one thing. From a 21st century perspective, what happened next sounds like almost unbelievable. After decades of terrorist attacks and modern security measures, we are used to airports checking everything. Metal detectors, baggage scanner, ID verifications, multiple security checkpoints. But in 1971, none of that existed. There were no metal detectors, no X-ray machines, no baggage screening, and certainly no security procedures like the ones we are familiar with today. A person could walk onto an airplane carrying almost anything. Nobody searched his briefcase, nobody checked for explosives, nobody had any reason to suspect him. And that is exactly why Cooper was able to calmly board the aircraft with what appeared to be a bomb. The plane is now in the air. 36 people are on board. At first, everything seems completely normal, until one moment changes everything. Cooper hands a note to a flight attendant. At first, she doesn't think much of it. After all, a man hiding a note to a flight attendant wasn't exactly unusual. She likely assumed it was just another passenger trying to get her attention. Cooper quickly realized she wasn't taking it seriously. Leaning slightly toward her, he calmly said, "Miss, you would better look at that note. I have a bomb." No shouting, no threats, no panic. He said it as casually as if he were commenting on the weather. The flight attendant, Florence, sat down beside him. Cooper opened his briefcase. Inside she saw wires, batteries and red cylinders that appeared to be explosives. Whether it was a real bomb or not remains unknown to this day. Then Cooper calmly began listing his demands. If everyone wanted to stay alive, he wanted $200,000 in cash, 4 parachutes, and a fuel truck waiting after landing. landing, and while making these demands, he behaved as if nothing unusual was happening. At one point, he even ordered a bourbon and soda. Then he paid for the drink. Strange, isn't it? In most hijackings, you imagine panic, screaming, threats, maybe even violence. But here, there was only silence. Meanwhile, on the ground, the situation was anything but calm. The FBI, local police, airline officials, and federal authorities were scrambling to gather the $200,000. Time was running out. The aircraft was already approaching Seattle. At approximately 5:40 p.m., the plane landed at Seattle-Tacoma Airport. But Cooper had one important condition. No one was to approach the aircraft without his approval. A short time later, the exchange began. The ransom money was delivered, the parachutes was delivered, and here is the truly remarkable part. Most of the passengers still had no idea the plane had been hijacked. They had simply been told there was a technical problem with the aircraft. Once the authorities fulfilled their side of the deal, Cooper fulfilled his. He released every passenger on board. The only people he ordered to remain were the pilots, the flight engineer, and one flight attendant. The next phase of his plan was about to begin. He instructed the crew to fly toward Mexico, but with some more specific conditions. The aircraft had to fly low, it had to fly slowly, and the flaps had to be extended. At that point, FBI investigators began to suspect that this man knew a lot more about airplanes than the average passenger. Let me explain why these instructions mattered. If the plane had been flying at its normal cruising altitude of around 30,000 feet, jumping from it would have been almost impossible. At that altitude, the air is extremely cold. Oxygen levels are much lower, and the aircraft is moving at a tremendous speed. The chances of survival would have been incredibly small. Cooper demanded a speed of roughly 170 knots from a jet airliner that is very slow, far slower than its normal cruising speed. Now, that information alone wasn't necessarily suspicious. Someone could have learned it from magazines or book about parachuting, but the flaps were a different story. How many people know what aircraft flaps actually do? Probably not many. Cooper knew that extending the flaps would make the aircraft slower, more stable, and easier to control at low speeds. Exactly the kind of conditions you would want if you were planning to jump out of it. And the choice of aircraft wasn't random either. Cooper specifically targeted a Boeing 727. At the time, it was one of the very few commercial airliners equipped with a rear ester, a staircase that could be lowered directly from the back of the aircraft beneath the tail. It looked something like this. See that staircase right there? That is what made the Boeing 727 unique, and what made Cooper's escape plan possible. Because of details like this, investigators began to suspect that Cooper was either a former military serviceman, a parachutist, or even a pilot. Keep watching, because later we will look at the leading theories about who he may have really been. At around 8 p.m., Cooper began preparing for the jump. He opened the bag and found the promised $200,000 inside. Adjusted for inflation, that's roughly $1.5 million in today's money. Then he sent the flight attendant into the cockpit, and just like that, she became the last person ever known to have seen D.B.Cooper. Now alone in the rear section of the aircraft, Cooper began making his final preparations. From inside the cockpit, the crew started hearing strange noises coming from the back of the plane. Rustling sounds, movement, something was happening. Perhaps that was the moment Cooper was putting on his parachute and securing the money. Just a few minutes later, the crew received an indicator showing that the rear ester had been lowered. Everyone immediately understood what that meant. The pilot tried contacting him through the intercom.
Do you need any help?
The response was short and simple.
No.
And then he jumped. Just imagine the scene. It's night. Heavy rain is falling. The temperature is hovering near freezing. Below you are nothing but the dark forests and the mountains of Washington state. And somewhere in the darkness, a man is falling through the sky with a bag full of cash strapped to his body. A man who has just hijacked an airplane and is attempting the most daring escape in American history. It sounds like something straight out of Hollywood movie, but this wasn't fiction. It really happened. We still don't know exactly where Cooper landed. The FBI was only able to estimate the area where he likely jumped from the aircraft. The most probable location was somewhere between Ariel and Woodland, Washington. At first, investigators believed he had landed deep in the forest of Washington state. That is where the search efforts were concentrated. But then, in 1980, a young boy named Brian made a discovery that changed the case forever.
Little Brian Ingram unearthed several packets of deteriorated $20 bills, and the FBI confirmed it.
We were going to make a campfire, and we found it. It was partially on top of the ground, you know. It was just beneath the sand.
Who found it?
Well, my son and I found it together. I was getting ready to drop the wood, and he cleared out the spot and rolled the money over on top of the sand.
While digging on a riverbank, he found a portion of Cooper's ransom money, about $6,000. And that is where things become complicated. The location, known as Bar, was nowhere near the area where the FBI believed Cooper had jumped. Suddenly, investigators were faced with a new mystery. How did the money get there? There are several possible explanations. The first theory is that Cooper died during or shortly after the jump, and the money was later carried downstream by the river. The second theory is that Cooper survived and somehow ended up near the river himself. As you have probably guessed by now, nobody ever found him. How is it possible that the largest manhunt in American history failed to produce a single definitive answer? Thousands of agents, countless searchers, years of investigation, and in the end, the only significant piece of evidence was $6,000 discovered by a random child nearly a decade later. That is what makes D.B.Cooper unique. You can build endless theories around him. Maybe he survived, maybe he died that very night, but if he died, where is the body? More than 50 years later, the facts remain astonishingly simple. We don't know what he really looked like, we don't know whether he survived, we don't know his real name, and if he did make it out alive, we have no idea what kind of life he lived afterward. D.B.Cooper stepped out of an airplane and into history, and somehow he never came back. So, who was Cooper really? Was he just an ordinary man who somehow came up with an extraordinary plan? Or was he something more? A former soldier? A pilot? Maybe even someone connected to organized crime? The truth is, nobody knows. But there are plenty of theories. One of the most interesting revolves around the name he gave himself. Most investigators believe that Don Cooper wasn't his real name at all. It was almost certainly an alias. At the time, a Canadian comic book series called Don Cooper was fairly popular. Its main character was a military pilot, a parachutist, and an aviation expert who regularly found himself involved in dangerous missions. Sound familiar? Some investigators believe Cooper may have borrowed the name directly from these comics. If that is true, it could tell us something important about him. Perhaps he had spent time in Canada. Perhaps he was familiar with military aviation. Whatever the reason, the choice seems far too specific to be a coincidence. So let's take a look at who Cooper might actually have been. The real person hiding behind the mask. Suspect 1. Kenneth Christensen. Why was he considered a suspect? Well, for starters, he checked a lot of boxes. He worked for an airline, he had served as a paratrooper during World War II. He knew aviation well and lived relatively close to where the hijacking took place. After the hijacking, people noticed that he seemed to be living much better than before. He could suddenly afford things that had previously been out of reach. Even his own brother reportedly said, if anyone could have done it, it was Ken. But despite all of that, there are some more fairly simple reasons why this theory falls apart. None of the flight attendants identified him as a Cooper. No physical evidence ever linked him to the hijacking. And perhaps most importantly, he was noticeably shorter than the description given by witnesses. So let's move on to the man many believe is the strongest candidate of them all, Robert Rexroth. Rexroth was the kind of person who didn't seem to mind being associated with the Cooper case. In fact, some would say he enjoyed it. He often played along with journalists, almost if he were teasing them. Like our previous suspect, Rexroth was both a military pilot and a parachutist. He also had a criminal record and spent much of his life attracting the attention of law enforcement. Because of his background, the FBI investigated him extensively. But even after all that, they were unable to prove anything. Years later, a team led by searcher Thomas Colbert once again placed Rexroth at the center of the investigation. They claimed to have found numerous indirect connections linking him to the hijacking. But indirect connections are not proof. In an old interview, Rexroth even hinted at the possibility, saying something along the lines of "could have been."
Are you the person who boarded a flight on November 24th, 1971, identifying yourself as Dan Cooper, to hijack the plane.
This man is probably a sociopath, more recently known as a psychopath or an antisocial personality.
Clinically.
Clinically.
Did you board a Northwest Orient flight on November 24th, 1971?
What difference does it make?
As a name Dan Cooper, because if you're D.B. Cooper, the world would want to know your story.
I would. So would the FBI and the secret indictment and Washington,
Bob, you're a
D.C.
folk hero. You're a
Oh,
folk
no,
hero.
come
Nobody
on.
cares.
His attorney later claimed that Rexrow enjoyed letting people believe he was D.B. Cooper. Whether that was because he was Cooper or simply because he liked the attention, nobody knows. Robert Rexrow died in 2019 at the age of 75, and when he died, the mystery remained unsolved. The FBI never officially identified D.B. Cooper, and to this day, no one can say with certainty who the hijacker really was. So that is the story. The most powerful country in the world was outsmarted by a single daring man. But what do you think? Who was D.B. Cooper really? Let me know your theory in the comments below. And if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Good luck, and I will see you in the next one.